Welcome to Order Militaris Radio TV. We here are lifelong Catholics, and what we do here is for free, in love of Jesus Christ, the Most Holy Trinity, His Holy Church, and we will defend our Holy Mother, the Church. Our work is the true sense of apostolate. Any funds raised goes back into this work for the equipment. This helps us to give you an unbiased, hard-hitting truth that is not controlled by political correctness or interest groups. Today's topic is St. Francis, and we welcome Brother Alexis Bonaldo to the show.
Thank you, AJ, for having me on Order Militaris Radio TV. Always a pleasure to be on this independent Catholic media apostolate, and a special pleasure today to talk about my Seraphic Father, St. Francis, one of the great saints of the Catholic Church, and one who has influenced probably more than any other in the Western Church, the whole Church, in so many ways. And so a lot of people would like to know more about St. Francis, and I see that you have a whole panoply of really good questions that most people don't know, wouldn't think to ask, or maybe wanted to ask and never heard the answer. So go to the horse's mouth, ask a Franciscan. And since I translated his writings into English from the Critical Latin edition, and I've done a fair amount of readings about St. Francis's life, I think I can give you some good, authentic answers to all these questions.
When was St. Francis born, and why did his dad rename him from John to Francisco?
Okay, so the exact day of St. Francis's birth is not certain. It was either the year 1181 or 1182, but most likely it was at the end of June, because his father was away in France trading cloth. His father was a cloth merchant, and the finest cloths of Europe in that day were being produced in the Low Countries. So he would go to the fairs in France and buy these fine cloths and bring them to Italy to sell. And he was away, and it would have been the summertime. And his mother, after his birth, decided to name him John. And John Bernardone was his name, Giovanni di Pietro di Bernardone. And she probably did that because he was born on or around the feast of the birth of John the Baptist. And that is what it is generally thought about when he was born. 1182, we're at the end of the 12th century. This is 100 years after the First Crusade. It's just in 7 years from now that the Third Crusade will begin with Richard the Lionheart, one of your great uncles. And it was an age of the faith. The Catholic faith was really flourishing almost everywhere. There was still a lot of controversies and stuff. In just 20 years will be the Fourth Lateran Council, which played a really important role in the reform of church discipline in the West. And everywhere the traditional Mass was said in Latin. The big orders of the day were the Benedictine orders. I'll talk about later when he founded this order. There was problems in the Benedictine orders, major problems, and this is probably one reason why our Lord called St. Francis, or sent us St. Francis, to found a new form of religious life that had not yet existed in the church, and which would imitate him in a way that no other had done or would do. So,
How was Francis growing up?
St. Francis grew up in Assisi, which is a small town to the east of Perugia. You might know Perugia because they're famous city for chocolates today, and it's the center of art. Small mountain town, and you can walk the length and breadth of Assisi in each direction in about 20 minutes. It's not that big of a town, and walled. He was a carefree youth, from what we know. His father, being a cloth merchant, meant that he was middle class or upper middle class. So he had everything he would want to have, and And by the time he was a teenager, 16, 17 years old, he was known for throwing parties for his friends and spending out late at night on the town. But it wasn't like in modern times. It's not like they had bars or anything like that. You usually went to a friend's house who held a eating fest and had a lot of food and drink. And there was no hard liquor in that day, so we're just talking about wines. And singing and playing instruments and singing along and frolicking, that kind of thing. He was known for it. He was famous for it. He was considered kind of one of the chief party guys in town. But it wasn't at all like modern times. So it wasn't a question of debauchery or immorality. It was just, I would say, probably gluttony and vainglory most of all, and just wasting time. He was not devout. He was Catholic, but he wasn't a devout Catholic. We know he was baptized and confirmed, but it's not like in his youth he was known to go to mass every day. And his father was really a very secular kind of guy and very worldly and avaricious, and his mother was known to be devout Catholic. But if you had mentioned the name Giovanni di Bernardone in his youth, people would say, "Oh yeah, one of those carefree guys, always partying and drinking. Won't see much. Nothing much will come of him, I guess, unless he becomes a cloth merchant."
Did Francis go to France, and what did he think of the troubadours? And we've lost them, folks. Must be a Dominican censor, a Benedictine censor. Hold on, folks, while we wait for him to return again. So while we wait, we are learning about the life of St. Francis. And he's back.
Yeah, I lost you just as you're ready to ask the second question.
So, did Francis go to France, and what did he think of the troubadours?
Yeah, so his name Giovanni and gives him the nickname Francesco, which means the French boy, and because his father liked French, and he ended up learning some French. And the people always ask, did he go to France? Once he becomes a friar, he does go to France. So there's some speculation that as a young man, he might have gone on a trip with his father one summer to France and to the fairs of France. We don't know for sure whether that is the case or not. I would probably say that it's highly possible that that was the case, at least when he was 14 or 15. And he was known to be a lover of the French language and of the French people. You have to remember that Assisi is in northern Italy, so it has more the character of a northern Italian town and very similar to the culture of southern France and things like that. So later in his life, he does go to France, and he spends, I think, 2 or 3 times he goes to France and preaches the gospel there, and is very well received. And in fact, France for centuries was one of the heartlands of devotion to Saint Francis. And we have many French kings named Francois, and in honor of Saint Francis, and not in honor. People think it's named after France. No, they're named after Saint Francis. Even there's a king of Spain named Francis after that, because Saint Francis ends up going to Spain too.
When did Francis become a knight, and what battles did he fight in?
Yeah, so in his as he grew to manhood, St. Francis is involved in 2 military operations. First of all, the city of Perugia wanted to extend its Assisi and Perugia, and this was traditionally the territory of Assisi. So the men of Assisi rallied and formed militia units to fight the Battle of Longstreet against Perugia. And St. Francis actually captained one of these units and outfitted himself and his men. He was that wealthy. and led them into battle. So he was no wimp. He was no, wallflower. He was a real man. And well, the battle ended disastrously because Perugia had superior cavalry and armaments, and St. Francis was captured, seeing that he was a captain. Because in the Middle Ages, the purpose of the battle was not to kill your enemy, just to scare him off, cause him to flee, or slightly wound him in the process, and to capture leaders so that you can ransom them for money. And they figured they could get a big ransom from Francis because he was so well outfitted. They figured he must have come from a noble family, but he really only came from a merchant family. So yes, he was captured, and he spent, I think, a year and a half in prison. And prisons back then were unheated, bread and water, rats all over the place, a bucket for your latrine, very unhealthy, and he may or may not have been able to have visitors. So his health deteriorated terribly. I think some of his friends died of disease in the prison. He undoubtedly, that's when he contracts tuberculosis, is in the prison there. And his second military adventure took place some years later, because after he's ransomed from Perugia, he spends 2.5 years regaining his strength because his health was just so bad. And once he regained his strength, his military career, he felt called military career again, and he equips himself in all the finest armor as a knight and heads off to southern Italy, the heel of the boot of Italy, called Puglia, to fight in the papal army against the German emperor, who was attempting to usurp the Pope's rights on who would be named as the King of Two Sicilies. And he was just all kind of zeal to serve Jesus Christ by fighting in the papal army. And it was on the road just a day or two's march from the city that he goes to sleep one night and has the famous dream that convinces him to serve not the servant, but the master. That is not the Pope, but Christ the King. And he turns back and comes back to city. And it was a great sacrifice because everyone thought he was a coward and that he didn't have the guts to go into battle, having bought all this equipment and all this finery. And he sold it all and he gave it to the poor. And he's saying, no, I'm going to serve God. And people didn't believe him. They say, you're just a coward creating, sing up an excuse. So that was a key point in his life. So he was very much pro-military. And we see in the third part of his life, once he becomes a friar, he goes on the Fifth Crusade, but we'll talk about that later.
Mm-hmm. Can you speak of the conversion St. Francis went through?
So there was 3 stages of his conversion. When he was recovering from his long illness, he began to realize that we're not made for this world. We're made for the world to come, because this world's passing and all its glories and fancies can pass away in a short time. And his second phase was when he had this dream on the way to Puglia in all his armor, a dream that he was some kind of a mystical vision that really struck him and convinced him to change his life, and now he's going to live for God. He didn't really know how that he would do that, but that's what he was going to do. The second, and so he came back and he sold his armor, he sold his goods, and his father was away, and he started even giving away some of the cloth in his father's storehouse to the poor, which to a certain extent he had a certain amount of right to, because he's the heir of his father. He only had one other brother, I think it was, and maybe a sister, but in a certain sense wasn't as an excess of zeal, so it wasn't, he would have needed the permission of his father. So when his father got back, it was like, and sparks flew, and there was lots of screaming for weeks on end, until St. Francis decided that he had to make completely a break with the world. So he goes to the bishop's courtyard, which is right next to the cathedral of the city, not far from St. Francis's house, only about maybe a 3-minute walk from his house. And he takes the tonsure. So in the Middle Ages, if you entered the service of the church as a porter, one of the first of the minor orders, you would receive tonsure and you would receive ecclesiastic dress. And normally they would just give you tonsure. The idea of taking the clerical dress was something that was passing out of practice. But St. Francis went to the extreme. He just took off all his clothing down to his underwear and gave it to the bishop and said, I'm going to choose God as my father now. They're trying to convince him not to do this. Because once he did that, he couldn't be an heir to his father anymore. He was renouncing his own inheritance. The father was outraged, and he says, now I'm going to take God the Father as my true father, and he renounced his own father to his face. It was probably the culmination of their argument over what he'd be. But he was the eldest son, and he wanted to serve God and not be just a cloth merchant. His father flew in such a rage that St. Francis had to hide out for a month. And he hid out in some grotto, and I think it was at Gubbio, where you can still find out a little kind of hole in the ground. And but it was there in that grotto that something happened of which there's very little record, because in that month of prayer and hiding in that grotto, God filled him with such grace that he comes out a saint, and from then on, he has all the strength of his vocation, and men start following him little by little, and he's no longer Giovanni di Bernardone. He's now Saint Francis. So those are the three phases of his conversion. The other fourth, final one is he goes to the church of San Damiano outside the town, just short walk from the town on the east side. And he had liked this church a lot because Saint Damon is a patron saint of the sick. And when he was sick, he'd often go to this church. So he would go and pray in this church because it was a quiet place, short distance from the city. And it's down a small road where no one even much goes today, unless they're going to that church. And it was there in that church the crucifix came alive and said, go and repair my house, which you can see is falling into ruin. And our Lord was referring to the church. St. Francis in his simplicity understood of this church. So he spent the next year personally repairing the church, begging stones and mortar from different people and repairing the church. And he goes on to fix up three churches: the Church of San Damiano, the Church of St. Peter, which is on a mountain across the valley from Assisi to the south, and then the little church dedicated to Our Lady down in the valley called the Our Lady of the Angels, the little portion of Our Lady of the Angels. And after fixing up that church, one day he's at Mass, and he hears the gospel, go sell everything you have, give it to the poor, and follow me. And he asks the priest to explain that afterward, and he decides that he feels inspired. This is what his vocation is to be. So he gives up all the little things he had been acquiring in those last 3 years and takes a single habit with a piece of rope around it. And that's when the Franciscan order is founded. And within a month, 2 other men join him in this. And that's those are the 4 or 5 stages of his conversion. It wasn't instantaneous like that. It was over a period of 3, maybe say 5, 7 years.
When does he go to Rome to get his rule approved?
So after a short time, I think it was, so his conversion takes place at Sunday around 1204. 1206, he already has about 12 followers. And, well, he needs a rule, so we decide on how they're going to live and who they're going to obey and what things they're going to find. And he prays a lot about it and writes down a short little rule, and he takes all his friars with him to Rome, all 12 of them, and because he has this dream that the Pope will grant him the favor, because you just don't go to Rome and ask the Pope to give you a rule in any age. It's unlikely it's going to happen, but he had this dream. Mm-hmm. So he comes to Rome, and it is the vigil of Saint Alexis, which is the feast of Saint Alexis, celebrated at Roman Aventine on the 17th of July, and he comes to the papal palace at the Lateran on the 16th. Now, unbeknownst to Saint Francis, Innocent III was very devoted to St. Alexis, and he was in the process of rebuilding the Basilica to St. Alexis, which he reconsecrates, I think, just 2 or 3 or 4 years later. So this poor man comes to him on the vigil of St. Alexis, and St. Alexis's title is the Poor Man, who lived under a staircase. I did a video from Rome Info on that. We did a live show from there early this summer. And he sees this poor man ask him to approve this rule with these other 11 poor men following him. And it's like, this is the cardinal saying, this guy's a crazy. He's probably one of these, Albigensian heretics, or one of these poor brethren heretics, they're going around. This is a common thing, pay him no attention. But that night on the feast of St. Alexis, Innocent III has this dream in which he sees the same poor man, Francis, holding up the Lateran Basilica, which is threatened to fall. And he understands that God has sent this man to save the church in times of need. So he gives St. Francis verbal permission, and he orders that Francis and his men be tonsured. He makes Francis a deacon, and I think he confers minor orders, or maybe the diaconate, on many of his other friars, and orders them to go out in the streets and preach the gospel, which was something unheard of. Preaching was always done in the church. So this was a radical, way of promoting the gospel that I won't use the word evangelization because people misunderstand what that means, but preach the Catholic faith in the streets, because people weren't coming to church anymore to hear the gospel and the catechism explained. And that was the year 1206, the summer, the 17th of July. And so from then on, for the next 20 years, St. Francis preaches the gospel with just the verbal permission. It wasn't until 1223 that he actually writes his rule down and gets it approved by the Pope in that year in the written form, which we call the Regula Beata, that all us friars now observe. What was in the text of that original rule is much debated because no written version of it has remained.
When does he go and preach the crusade?
So St. Francis, once he gets ordained a deacon by the Pope, he moves from being under the jurisdiction of the Bishop of Assisi to the Pope of Rome, and bishops all around Europe then start welcoming his friars, and men from all around Western Europe start joining his order. Within, I think, 10 years, 5,000 men join his order, and it becomes one of the largest orders in Christendom. And by the end of the century, it has more than like 50,000 friars. Okay, so it was just absolutely phenomenal, and they were all well behaved and gave a good example of virtue to everyone, and everyone was very impressed, and his fame spreads all around Europe, although most people never actually met him. Most of the friars didn't even meet him. He would send friars 2 by 2 to different parts of Europe. They'd found a house and they'd receive vocations, and he founded houses in Portugal, Spain, France, England, Scotland, Germany, northern Italy, Poland, Hungary, all around the West, what we call Belgium today, the Netherlands, Denmark, I think even Sweden. So he is inspired on several occasions to go on the missions to convert the Moors. As a matter of fact, in the Rule of St. Francis, we're the first order that actually has the obligation to seek the conversion of Muslims and preach the gospel to unbelievers in the missions. But in the year, I think it was 1216, the Fifth Crusade is called, and it's organized by the year 1217. The fleet departs from Split on the Adriatic Sea, because it was supported by the King of Hungary and the kings of Germany and the Pope. And St. Francis heads out with the Fifth Crusade, and their objective was to deter the military force of the Sultan of the Caliph of Egypt, and prevent him from crushing the Crusader states in the Holy Land. So they land at Damietta, which is on the Nile Delta, on the eastern corner of it, and they capture the city easily. they spend the whole summer there. I think they're there for about a year and a half, and it was a rather it was like they succeeded in a certain extent. They succeeded in their strategic objective, but they didn't succeed in their tactical objectives of taking more cities. But they did convince the Sultan to not send his troops to the Holy Land. And he was an avid member of the Crusade. He brought a priest along so that the men would have a chaplain, and he preached to the men every day about living the life of virtue and being prepared for death. And he was very interested in whether the Crusaders would have victory or not. So he prayed a lot to know from God. And during one of the most major battles, right before it, he said, don't go to this battle, you will not have victory, which wasn't the kind of message he wanted to give to the men, but that's what God told him, because he wanted to preach victory, but God said, no, you're going to lose that battle. So he did. He warned the men, but they wouldn't listen to him, and they did lose that battle. And this crusade was the last crusade under the auspices of the Vatican, of the Apostolic See, because so many things went wrong in it. And the Crusaders were attempting to do something that was logistically extremely complex. It was an amphibious invasion. And then it was culturally complex because they had no idea what the Egyptian culture was like. They had no preparation for the climate or the diseases of Egypt. And the heat when it comes on in Egypt was just so tremendous that they all like were wasting away in their armor. And since the Crusades were a voluntary thing, troops would come, troops would leave, and they'd see how bad it was, and they wouldn't stay on. And so they would have had victory if all the forces were present at the same time, but that was never the case. So there were a lot of problems at that. But St. Francis was on that crusade, and well, at the end of the crusade, he did some heroic things. And he decided that he didn't decide, but he was inspired by God to attempt to convert the Sultan, and that is a wonderful tale in of itself. And he ends up getting a passport from the Sultan. He pilgrimages all over the Holy Land and visits all the holy places before he comes back to Italy. I think he didn't come back to Italy until like the winter of 1220. So he was in the Holy Land maybe a year and a half.
Ooh. How did he convert the Sultan?
So this is a true story. Most people sign to the myth, but we have absolute historic record from the earliest years after the event, and it made him famous in all Europe. Historians, even in France, spoke about it. He was considered the hero of the Fifth Crusade for what he did. So inspired by God, he takes his fire chaplain, and they walk across enemy lines. Now, the Muslims made it very clear that if any Christian was found to have crossed their lines, he would be put to death on the spot. So no Christian would dare do this, not even merchants, if it was to be certain death. But it was revealed to St. Francis that he would not be put to death. And the Muslim guards capture him, and they're ready to put him to death. And they beat him and his chaplain up very badly, several times. But they don't put him to death, and he demands to see the Sultan, and they bring him into the Sultan's presence. And I guess after recuperating some, he gets an audience with the Sultan. And St. Francis begins to preach the gospel to him and show him that the Islamic faith is false and the Christian religion is true. And he, by many arguments, shows that the Islamic religion just doesn't make any sense because it's carnal, it's not spiritual, it's not based on rewards in the world to come, but rewards in this world, and it's illogical, it has no miracles behind it, and one thing after the other. So the Sultan was a very learned man. He was knowledgeable in many languages, and he was much more learned than the average imam. He's a very literate man. And he delighted to listen to what St. Francis said. In his court were all these Muslim clerics who were very learned men. And by listening to St. Francis, it was like goading them. And he wasn't an observant Muslim, so he liked the fact that St. Francis was annoying the hell out of these Muslim clerics who were calling him a blasphemer, an infidel, and demanding his death. So at the dramatic point of the several days of dialogue, St. Francis says, "You have a fire here in your court," because it was wintertime, and in the Middle Ages, you didn't heat yourself with a heater or an iron stove. There's no such thing. You built a fire in the center of your hall room, and usually there was a hole in the roof above or your tent above, and that's how everything was heated. So St. Francis says, you have a fire here in the center of your hall. I am willing to enter this fire with one of your Muslim clerics, and let he who comes out alive be witness to what religion is the true religion. And the Sultan says, well, maybe you will be burned alive. And St. Francis says, if I'm burned alive, it's not because the Christian religion is false, but because I am a sinner. But I will show you that the Christian religion is true because I will enter the fire. So who has the conviction that the Islamic religion is true, and let him enter the fire with me hand in hand? So at that point, the Sultan turns to all his Muslim scholars and says, well, who believes the Islamic religion is that true? And they all one by one flee the hall until there's no Muslim scholars left. It's just St. Francis and the Sultan. And at that point, according to Franciscan tradition, the Sultan tells St. Francis, you have convinced me which religion is the true one, but if I convert, they'll put me to death. And St. Francis gives him a cross to wear around his neck, and the Sultan gives him some precious gifts, which are conserved to this day in the convent of Assisi, a convent of St. Francis at Assisi. So it's proof to the historical fact. He gives him a huge horn, huge ivory horn with gold trim, which is a passport, the Sultan's passport to his realms. It was like, something the size of a cell phone, solid gold. So this is not a small amount, and it had it stamped in it in Arabic. This is a passport, and gave him some other things. I forget what the other thing he gave him. So and this goes down in history. Now, we know for a fact from monumental evidence in Egypt, it's on the tomb of this Sultan is inscribed, he was not a perfect Muslim, but he went to his doom after speaking to the Christian Sufi. And so this is the reference, because a Sufi in Arabic is a holy man who wears wool, and that's what St. Francis did. So even the Muslims recognize that this man did not die a Muslim. And according to Franciscan tradition, at his death, he called friars to come to him, because he gave St. Francis's friars permission to set up convents in the Holy Land. And 2 friars came to him and baptized him before he died, according to Franciscan tradition, although some historians say that that never happened. But the tombstone seems to indicate that that was the case. So, but the story that he had crossed enemy lines and came back with a passport and a horn and the Sultan's blessing spread like wildfire to Europe. So I think William Thierry, a famous French historian of the 13th century, actually records it. And it made him and his order famous throughout Europe. And so many crusaders, after they left service, joined the Franciscan order because they felt it was an order that backed the Crusades 100%, and that their founder was a truly heroic man and a true crusader spirit. So most people don't know about this. So what you hear about today is St. Francis is the saint of peace. He's against guns. He's against war. He's a pacifist. This is all Marxist, excuse my language, C-R-A-P, okay? It's a complete historical lie. Franciscans have been military chaplains. Great Franciscan saints like Mark of Aviano and John of Capistrano were at the head of Catholic armies fighting the Turks. And the Franciscan order has always preached all of the Crusades. And after it was founded, it was always strong for the recapture of Christian lands, and not just the recapture of lands that belonged to the powers that were fighting, but even lands where Christians once ruled, the recapture of the lands from Islam. The medieval Catholic didn't believe that once Muslims took something, they got to keep it. That wasn't the medieval conception. The medieval conception of Catholics was, we have the right to take back everything they took from us, even if they've held it for centuries, which is what the Catholics did in Spain, of course. Mm-hmm. So it was one of the most heroic, I think it's the most heroic thing St. Francis did in his lifetime, for which in modern times almost no one speaks, because it would break all the fake Masonic, modernist, Marxist categories of who they want St. Francis to be to advance their agenda, which he was not.
When and where does he get the Stigmata?
So St. Francis is known almost universally for having the stigmata. Wherever you see his statues and his images, you'll see the wounds in his hand and in his feet, and he should have had one in his side. And St. Francis did actually have the stigmata, and he was the first saint in the history of the church to actually bear the wounds of Christ. And St. Francis' stigmata were a grace which most people didn't know he had. He was so humble, he didn't tell anyone about it. But they noticed almost immediately that he had a hard time walking and he couldn't write anymore and everything. So it happens in the year 1224 that he's making a Lent in honor of St. Michael the Archangel. So he starts fasting on on August 16th, and he's going to fast all the way until September 29th. But on the morning of the 14th of the Triumph of the Cross, on Mount Averna, where he was doing his retreat, a seraphim descends from heaven, and at the sight of it, the lightning bolts come from the seraphim who takes on the image of Christ crucified, connecting the wounds of the crucified to Francis's hands, feet, and side. And the wounds of Christ are impressed on him, and they weren't just surface wounds; they went right through the hand. Matter of fact, on his hand, one of the friars said, there was a nails in his hand, nails of flesh in open wounds, and it became more well known towards the end of his life, and his wounds remained in death. Unlike Padre Pio's, whose wounds disappeared after he died, St. Francis' wounds remained in death, and it was the invocation of St. Francis as someone with these wounds was something that worked many miracles after his death. There's a famous miracle that took place about 90, 80 years after his death. And there was, the Franciscans and the Dominicans have always been very friendly. So this Dominican friar visits this Franciscan monastery in Italy, and he sees a fresco of St. Francis on the wall of the refectory, which is the room in where they eat. And it shows St. Francis with his wounds. And this Dominican was a critic and says, I don't believe that. It's a bunch of, old women's stories. You just guys made it up to get people to be devoted to your saint. Not going to listen to it at all. And those wounds are all fake. Well, at his words, the wounds in the fresco begin bleeding human blood. And the Dominican friar is confounded and falls on his knees and says, I never will deny the truth, the veracity that St. Francis had these wounds again, and he becomes an ardent preacher of St. Francis, his holiness. But I think something like 25 papal bulls confirm St. Francis was in fact crucified, received the wounds of Christ, and he's not the only Franciscan. Padre Pio had the wounds, and St. Leonard of St. Joseph of Leonisa actually preached the gospel in Istanbul once it was captured by the Turks, and they actually crucified him by hanging him up on 4 hooks on his hands and feet. And he survived because the Genoese rescued him, and he had wounds in his hands and feet the rest of his life, and he didn't die of it. But that wasn't a mystical grace. That was actually violence done by Turks. So St. Francis, his stigmata are very true. And there's actually a feast in the church for it. September 17th is the feast of the stigmata of St. Francis, and we friars believe that on that day he descends into purgatory, and whatever friars have ended up there in the last year, in virtue of his merits, he brings them to paradise.
Now, after this is when he starts to go blind and all that. What happens to cause all these ailments?
Okay, so St. Francis had tuberculosis, but his blindness, scholars believe, happened from the fact that he probably washed his face in the water of the Nile without boiling the water of the Nile. And the Nile, as you know, flows from the deep hearts of Africa. It's full of parasites, and one of them causes blindness. The parasite enters the retina and causes progressive blindness. In fact, millions of people of Africa suffered from this blindness only until recently, where they developed a medicine, a cure from it. And it's terrible plague in all West Africa. They actually have to put chemicals into the river every now and then to cleanse them. Don't ever wash your face in a river of Africa. I tell you that, or you go blind too. So that's probably what caused his blindness towards his end of his life, though he suffered from tuberculosis that spread to his bones, his lungs, and his lymph glands, which are very terrible. He had such an infection of the lymph glands of his head that the friars pleaded with the Pope to send one of his most expert doctors to cauterize him, and with a hot iron, he attempted to stop the infection by cauterizing the whole side of St. Francis's face up to his ear. And it was such a horrible sight that all the friars who were present ran out. They couldn't bear to look at it. And afterwards, St. Francis said, "I thank the Lord Jesus who gave me the grace to endure this medical treatment that even my friars could endure." And then he turned to the doctor and said, "And if you need to apply the iron again, do it." So this was the depictions of St. Francis as, pushover pansy are just completely wrong. This guy had, I can't say the word because I'm a friar. This guy had manliness. He was no wimp at all.
Oh, probably a little bit late on this, but there's some miracles he did, including what was it, preaching to fish or birds or something?
He did a whole sort of miracle. So one day, yes, no one would hear him preaching. And so he preached to the birds, and the birds all gathered around and listened to him preach. This is a miracle that was also redone by St. Anthony, who preached to fishes, and no one would listen to him preaching at Rimini. And one day he went over to the canal, and all the fish came up to the surface and listened to him preach. St. Francis converted the wolf of Gubbio. He went to the town of Gubbio, which was not far of Assisi, in one year, and everyone was terrorized in town because his wolf was killing all the sheep and attacking people. Perhaps it was rabid. And St. Francis stayed in the town and was told at what hours of the day the wolf would come about roaming. And St. Francis went out to meet this wolf, and he admonished Brother Wolf to be a good Christian and stop attacking the Christians of the town. And he promised the wolf that if this is the case, he would get the people in the town to agree to give Mr. Wolf some food every day. And at that, the wolf knelt down and showed sign of penance, and St. Francis embraced Brother Wolf and gave him absolution. And this is called the Wolf of Gubbio, and the cranium of the Wolf of Gubbio is actually held in the reliquary at Gubbio. You can go see it. And the people promised from then on they would give food to any wild dog or wolf they saw, and even to this day they keep up that practice in memory of St. Francis and his mediation with the animals. But he did other things. Like once, St. Francis was one day wanted to preach to people against sloth and gluttony. And while he was preaching, this big fat pig came by, and he said, "You gluttons and you slothy people, you're just like this pig, and you know what's going to happen to you. You're all going to turn to stone in hell just like this pig." Well, the people just thought he was just exaggerating. But the next day, the pig was found floating upside down in a gully. Its flesh had become so hard that no dog could even eat it, and that put the fear of God into people. On another case, his most wonderful miracle of all was he was passing through Sessa Aronca on the way back from visiting St. Michael's Shrine in southern Italy, and I've been to the church in Sessa Aronca where this miracle took place, and he was stopped in the street by the parents of this girl, and they said, "We only had one child, our daughter, and she died, and she's at the age of 16. I don't know if she died of blood poisoning or something like that." And the priests had taken the body, as they did with all the dead back then, and they buried her in the crypt. But what they first did is they would hang the body upside down, drain the blood out, and then bury the body. Because in this church, there was all the instruments for doing the work of a mortician, because that's who were the morticians in the Middle Ages. It was the clergy or the religious. So the parents say, "We beg you to raise our daughter from the dead." Well, St. Francis was like, he must have had the special knowledge of God. This is something God wanted. So he goes down into the crypt and he tells the priest to take the body off the meat hooks and place it on the table. And then stands up on the table and lies down on top of the body, and he prays that the life of God enter the girl, and she comes back to life, imitating the miracle of I think Elijah, who did the same thing. And the girl came back to life on the 4th day after her death, and there's a big monument in that church to this day. One of the first saints in the Middle Ages to raise anyone from the dead. It was absolutely spectacular miracle, but most people didn't know about it because St. Francis asked everyone to not admit what happened until after his death. But the people of Sasavone can remember that to his day. But after his death, something like 57 extraordinary miracles happened. Some as simple as one boy, I think he was at Siena, he swallowed a marble, and he was choking to death on it. It was a big marble, and it blocked his whole trachea. And the parents prayed to St. Francis, and the marble popped out on its own. And others were miraculous healings of different kinds. And in a very good edition of the Little Flowers of St. Francis, at the end there should be a thing called a tract on the miracles of St. Francis. It doesn't exist in most editions because the modernists took it out, but it lists all the miracles that were brought forward for his canonization. He was canonized, I think, in 1228, just 2 years after his death. He's one of the first saints ever canonized, and because of the extraordinary miracles worked after his death, and even during his life, not like these phony miracles today where they say, I had a dream and then the doctors found I wasn't sick. That's not a miracle.
Where and when does St. Francis die?
St. Francis died at Assisi on the evening of October 3rd, the beginning of October 4th in the year 1226. He had been sick for more than a year after receiving his stigmata. They carried him in a stretcher. They made it as far, he wanted to die in Assisi because if he died in any other city, they would have kept his body as a trophy and built a church there, but he wanted to die in his hometown. He made it as far as the Portiuncula in the church below the city, and they laid him on the ground, and he said, lay me on the ground, I want to die as a poor man. And he was buried at the Portiuncula. Well, no, he wasn't buried at the Portiuncula. His body was then taken by the friars to the convent of St. Francis up above in the city, and his heart was buried at the Portiuncula, although it said his heart. And they were so afraid that someone would steal his body that the minister of the order hid his body, and for centuries, 7 centuries, no one knew he was buried, but he was actually buried in the column that held up the high altar of the basilica built in his honor. And you can go see his mortal remains today in the casket of stone that they hid him in.
One person we didn't put into this show was St. Clare, and she was a fighter also. She had to face down some Turks too.
St. Clare, great saint. You could do a whole program on her. Her feast day is in August 11th, 12th, depending what calendar you follow. She was a daughter of a nobleman in Assisi, and the women in her age weren't allowed to go outside. The young women, they had to stay in their houses. But she'd hear St. Francis preaching in the streets through the grills of her window, and she became very much inspired by the desire to live a poor life. And she goes on to found an order of Poor Clares that has the same rule as St. Francis's, except that they're cloistered. And they're called Poor Clares today. Whenever you see a Poor Clare monastery, they're the daughters of St. Clare. But she was so holy, even in her youth, that when she decides to become a nun and take the habit, her sister and some friends spirit her out of the house down to the Portiuncula one night, and to receive in the Portiuncula the tonsure, where St. Francis cut off her hair with some scissors, and the habit. And her family heard about this, and they come on horseback with all their men at arms, and they say, what on earth are you doing with our daughter and our family late at night in this church? And they break down the doors, they grab her to haul her back home. And dozens of strong men tried to move her. None of them could move her. God gave her an extraordinary mystical grace, which rarely happens in the history of saints. It's called of immobility. And it's whereby the divine power holds a person in a certain spot, and all the forces of nature could move and nothing will happen. And they tried with horses and ropes and everything. They couldn't budge her. And finally they gave up, and they realized this was a sign of God that he was calling Clare to be his virgin spouse. So, and she was also a battler too, because when the many years later, after the death of St. Francis, the German emperor, in a war against the papacy, and was employing Muslim mercenaries, and they embarked on the coast of Tuscany, and they came up to Assisi, and they were pillaging the whole city. And St. Clare knew that they'd break into her convent and rape all the women, because that's what Muslims do, Muslim mercenaries. So she prayed to God for inspiration, and then she went into the chapel, and she took the monstrance with the Blessed Sacrament in it and carried it out to the walls, because her convent's built right in the walls. And she defiantly held it up against the Muslims, even though she could have been shot at any moment by an arrow. And at the sight of the Blessed Sacrament in her hands, they were struck by some kind of divine force, and they all fled. And so they never did pillage the city. And she's considered the protectress, the hero of Assisi, for that miraculous defense of the city. And she picked up the Blessed Sacrament by divine command. She was asked to do that. Women aren't supposed to ever touch the Most Blessed Sacrament in the monstrance, but she only held the monstrance. She didn't actually touch the sacrament. Yeah, so she was a fighter too. The saints in the Middle Ages were not pacifists. Pacifism is an invention of Marxism to disarm Catholics. Don't ever fall for it.
Yep. So, any last words on St. Francis?
He's a good St. Francis is a great saint. What could I possibly say about St. Francis? He lived the gospel literally. He was a simple man, a man of great faith, not anything like so many of the clergy and religious today. He believed without doubt. He loved without reserve. He hoped without hesitation. He served even in suffering and in shame. He never gave up. He was afraid of nothing but of offending God. He wasn't slack in prayer. He was ardent in what he asked for God, and he was faithful in the promises he kept. And he's a great saint, and we need more friars like him in the world. Unfortunately, they don't observe his rule anymore. They don't even wear their habits anymore. It's terrible. It is said by many saints that when the Franciscan order is weak, the church is weak. And when the order is strong, the church is strong. And this is probably why the church is in such chaos today, because nearly all the friars have apostatized from the Catholic faith or from the observance of the rule. It's a really shameful thing. And the orders of the Franciscans orders have been overrun by modernists, sodomites, apostates, Satanists, Pachamama worshippers, and that's why most people ask me, can I recommend any Franciscans to them? And I have to say, I cannot. I'm not a member of the order myself. I'm a hermit precisely for that reason, because none would take me in. I'm too Catholic for them. So, yeah, if you feel you have a Franciscan vocation and you want to live it the way St. Francis did, contact HA at Ordo Militaris Radio TV and have them pass your contact information on to me, because I've had zeal for more than 20 years to refound the order, and most of the trad organizations have come out and attacked it, and they try to turn their vocations against it, and I never understood that. But now that we understand how much they're controlled by the world and what's going on to undermine the church, I can now see why that's the case. But so if you feel you have a Franciscan vocation, don't take advice from a priest. don't take advice from religious. Read the Little Fathers of St. Francis, read Bonaventure's Life of St. Francis, published by 10 books, and then contact me, because you're not going to get the truth from anyone alive today, pretty much. They all will tell you some outrageous lie to destroy your vocation or turn you aside, alas. And if you're homosexual, you don't have a vocation to follow St. Francis. You have a duty to repent of your sins. Okay, so.
Yeah. So you have a true vocation to become a Franciscan. Put it in the comments of today's show. I'll pass it on to Brother Alexis and see what happens.
Many people ask me, but brother, how could you be head of a private military corporation if you're a Franciscan? I hope today's program helps you realize that the Franciscans have always been a pro-military order, even though we are pledged personally to peace. We don't bear arms, and we don't start conflicts. But we do supply military chaplains, and we do support the military and vets. We always have, and that's true Franciscans. Any others that you hear that are talking about pacifism, stuff like, they're all false. They're not true ones at all. So, and we've had many saints in our order who were military veterans. So, and we take men at any age in the life, as long as they're free of debt, not married, not divorced, and in good health.
This is Order Militaris Radio TV signing off. Deus Volt.
Deus Volt.